Colombian teachers begin a 48-hour strike to demand protection from the mounting violence. 20,000 oil workers suspend their strike in Brazil. Petrobras agrees to return to talks. And South Africa's president hits out against the country's last apartheid-era leader. Hello, welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez in Quito, and this is from the South. Teachers in Colombia have begun a 48-hour strike to protest at the threats and attacks suffered by many of their colleagues. Their union is demanding that the government of Iván Duque provides guarantees for teachers, a number of whom have been murdered as part of the paramilitary campaign against social and community leaders. Our correspondent Hernán Tobar was at the teachers' protest in Bogotá.
About 350,000 teachers have stopped work in protest at the increasing violence in the country, which has affected them directly. There have been teachers murdered, threatened, and forced to leave their communities. To understand more about the situation that teachers are now facing in Colombia, let's talk to Nelson Alarcón, who is the president of the teachers' union, FECOD. What is the reason for you to call this strike exactly?
The threats, attacks and murders of teachers are on the increase in Colombia, especially those who are leaders and activists in our trade union. So we are demanding that the government really implement effective policies to provide security and protection for all of us.
And how many teachers have been murdered so far this year?
Just this year, 2 teachers have been murdered, and more than 240 have received threats across the country.
So that gives you an idea of the situation for teachers in Colombia today. Teachers are now protesting here in Bogotá and in many other towns and cities around Colombia. Here, the protesters will be marching to the Ministry of Labor to demand these guarantees for teachers in the face of the violence from armed paramilitary groups.
That was Hernán Tobar from Colombia. In other news, Venezuela is moving towards a new electoral authority as part of the dialogue with sectors of the opposition. The National Assembly Committee that will appoint the new members of the National Electoral Council, or CNE, has been meeting in Caracas to plan the next steps. The selection of a new CNE to oversee this year's parliamentary elections was one of the most important early agreements to come out of the dialogue. And Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has declared a national energy emergency after the U.S. government imposed unilateral sanctions on the Russian oil company Rosneft for trading in Venezuelan crude. President Maduro also created a presidential commission that will be tasked with transforming the oil industry due to the growing number of U.S. sanctions.
Yesterday, a new set of criminal sanctions, was imposed against our oil company and the Russian company Rosneft. We have rejected this batch of measures. During the last 3 years, a state oil company, PDVSA, has resisted, standing alongside the mobilized working class. The company has been fighting against these criminal sanction measures that aim to destroy PDVSA, which is the main company of all Venezuelans.
President Maduro has also called on the Venezuelan people to take to the streets and protest against the latest set of U.S. sanctions.
I ask all the people in Venezuela to mobilize for the defense of PDVSA, the defense of the workers of the oil industry of Venezuela. No more Trump, no more sanctions, no more blockades. Long live PDVSA.
Canada is once again hosting the so-called Lima Group this afternoon in Ottawa. We are now going to look at live images of this meeting. The Venezuelan government has characterized this group as an interventionist tool led by the United States, which was formed to assist Washington's foreign policy and intervene in Venezuela's sovereign affairs. The group has also been denounced for its role in seeking further sanctions, which affect the daily lives of the Venezuelan people.
renews our commitment to our efforts.
And a group of people from social movements in Canada will be picketing outside of the Lima Group event later today. Among those protesting will be teacher Pierre Soublier and university student Vincent Cama, who are now joining us. Thank you for your time.
Hello. Hi, good to be here.
So let's begin with Pierre. Canada has now hosted several of these Lima Group meetings. So why do you feel it's important to protest, and what are your demands?
Well, first of all, it's good to remember that only on January 27th, Canada received the imposter Guaido. And it's good to recall that at that time, the Canadian Parliament applauded him as being the President Guaido, which was not only shameful, but farcical. And as for today, the Canadian government is continuing to work, actually has taken the head of the Lima Group, is organizing meetings, and it's exactly as was said a minute ago, is that this Lima Group is made up of countries which are working in terms of trying to, for a change of government in Venezuela, causing all sorts of harms, or supporting the sanctions. And the thing is that the Canadian government is doing all this under the pretext of returning democracy to Venezuela. So what we're raising is that we have no business interfering in the affairs of Venezuela. And the first thing that we have to do is stop participating and supporting all sanctions which are causing grave harms to the Venezuelan people.
So, Vincent, Pierre mentioned these sanctions that Guaido is calling for them. They have, of course, affected negatively its own people. So how can these actions press on governments, not only in Canada, but in other countries as well, to reject these requests?
How can these actions, like our action?
Protests that you're doing, the picketing, standing out and saying that it's wrong to call for more sanctions on Venezuela?
Well, hopefully it brings attention to the issue and just how deeply involved Canada is in these systems of these movements for regime change. I mean, Canadians are, on the whole, pretty good people, and I think if you get a chance to talk to them, they would reject the interference by their government. But we don't get that here. The mainstream media in this country does not talk about any of the sanctions, for example, that we've gone along with the United States in implementing. We don't get to hear about the seizing of food. We don't get to hear about the robbery of Venezuelan funds in England. We don't get to hear about any of this kind of stuff. So it's hard to get that message out. And right now we're just a very small group of people, but hopefully we can make the effort to connect issues because right now. I don't know. We have a long way to go before we can get any kind of critical mass, but we're trying our best.
And Vincent, what has been the position of Canada's government on Venezuela? How has it evolved through time? Walk us through a little bit of that.
Okay, the position has basically been to encourage. Well, here's the thing. So beyond the U.S. comprador kind of status, Canada is committed to the assertion of its powers in poorer countries in order to access their resources and labor. Okay, so we know that 41% of mining companies active in Latin America have their headquarters in Canada. So a lot of this is about Canadian interest as well, right? So. We have a bottom line where this country basically exists for the benefit of a very few wealthy corporations, and they act not only abroad in this fashion, but they're acting this way right now here in Canada against the Indigenous people, against the Wet'suwet'en people. They're trying to invade their lands, which are unceded. So it's the same thing. Like you have colonialism at home. Right, that is continuing, and imperialism abroad. That's Our friend Arnold August made that point. So I think that's basically what Canada's whole raison d'etre is.
And now I want to go back to Pierre because it was very interesting what he was saying before, and I want to connect it with also Trudeau's position on Latin America in general, because it's not only about a matter of what's happening in Venezuela. We have a coup in Bolivia, we have repression by police in Chile. What's his position, Justin Trudeau's position on Latin America?
Well, generally speaking, I think the way things are evolving is that Canada has taken more and more a position of openly supporting the coup d'etat that are taking place in these countries. Like there was the same thing in the Honduras several years ago. And this is a big problem because it doesn't reflect, like the Quebec people and the Canadian people have a long tradition of opposing wars. They have of opposing interference of the U.S. in particular in the affairs of other countries. And now what we're doing is that more and more we're going to the forefront and adopting exactly the same positions, which are in favor of overturning legitimate governments and setting up people who are favorable to. We've played the same role in Haiti, for example, in 2001, I think it was, or 2002. I'm sorry if I can't remember the exact date, but Canada played a straightforward role in the coup d'etat that took place and that took out Aristide and set up governments which were favorable to. I remember Clinton at the time who stated that this government was very favorable to the U.S., the one that was set up afterwards. So this is what we're opposed to at this time, in the sense of saying this does not reflect what the Canadian people want.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Pierre and Vincent, for your time, and take care out there.
Thank you.
Take care.
That was Pierre Soublier and Vincent Cama from Canada. And after this break, the IMF says Argentina's debt is unsustainable. Don't go away.
Who's moving the chessmen? What interests motivate the actors behind each event? The board is deployed there. Critical move. Investigates every event from Monday to Friday. Only on Telesur.
Welcome back. More news at this hour. After 2.5 weeks on strike, 20,000 oil workers in Brazil have suspended their stoppage. The state-controlled oil company Petrobras has promised to restart talks with the unions. Brian Meir reports.
The Brazilian National Federation of Petroleum Workers, the FUPE, announced a temporary suspension of its nationwide strike, which has been going on for 2 weeks and is the largest strike of its kind that's taken place in Brazil since 1995. One of the workers' main demands was that Petrobras cease its plans to shut down a petrochemical plant in Paraná State, which would result in 1,000 layoffs. Now the company's given in to that demand, and so they've temporarily suspended the strike. But there are bigger issues at stake. Since the 2016 coup, the government has privatized almost 80% of the offshore petroleum reserves. They've started dismantling Brazil's capacity to refine petroleum. They've started importing petroleum from the United States. And the workers are just worried that there's a general plan to completely dismantle the Petrobras system. And this is why this Friday, across the country, 20,000 union workers are going to meet in assemblies and decide if this suspension will be permanent or if they'll restart strike.
That was Brian Meir from Brazil. Argentina's debt is unsustainable. That's what the International Monetary Fund has concluded after meeting government officials in Buenos Aires. President Alberto Fernandez celebrated the IMF announcement, which stated it wasn't economically or politically feasible for Argentina to pay back its loans. The IMF also supported President Fernandez's suggestion that his government first needs to focus on the social needs of Argentinians. The IMF will now begin a new debt negotiation with the government. Earlier, we were joined by financial expert Eric Toussaint of the Campaign Against Third World Debt, or CADTM. He warned that the IMF must not be trusted, despite its claims that it agrees that Argentina's debt is unsustainable in its current form.
I think we should be very cautious with this type of declaration from IMF, because they say the payment of the debt is unsustainable, but they will never accept to cut off a part of the debt from Argentina to the IMF. So they are asking the other creditors, the private creditors, to accept to reduce the debt, and I don't think they will accept. So my recommendation would be to the Argentinian government is to do what Rafael Correa did in 2007, 2008, just after being elected for the first time. He organized an audit commission of the debt to identify the illegal or illegitimate or odious part of the debt. In 2018, Mauricio Macri asked Donald Trump to put a pressure on the IMF to convince the IMF to give a credit of $57 billion to Mauricio Macri. It is the most important credit from the IMF in his history. And it was clear already in the summer 2018 when the IMF took this decision under the pressure of Donald Trump that the debt was unsustainable. It's very important from the point of view of the interest of the people of Argentina to refuse to be submitted another time to the IMF and the imperialism. The repayment of Argentina to the private creditors is for the amount of 30 billion in 2020. So Argentina needs to suspend the payments.
Now we head to the Caribbean. The 31st intersessional meeting of CARICOM heads of government ended in Barbados on Wednesday with a resolution to improve integration and overcome disparities among the 15 member states. The two-day conference saw leaders discuss their response to the coronavirus outbreak, the elimination of taxes for transport and trade, as well as proposed fixed roaming rates for the region. They also deliberated on a potential Caribbean-African forum. CARICOM Chair Mia Motley said that evening out the inequalities between the poorer and richer members would be a pillar of true integration.
One of the problems that has bedeviled the community for some time has been the issue of the CARICOM Development Fund. And we recognize, as I've said over and over, that in any single market, a single economy, there are winners and there are losers. And it is to that extent that Chapter 7 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas speaks to the issue of there being need for a fund to be able to assist disadvantaged countries, disadvantaged sectors, disadvantaged regions. Member states have committed to capitalizing this fund, but this will never be enough to do what needs to be done particularly with all of the challenges that the region faces at this point in time. Yesterday I outlined a number of them, and we keep seeing new challenges as we did with the COVID-19 virus. And to that extent, therefore, we feel strongly that we need to revisit the structure of the CARICOM Development Fund and to enable it to be able to raise additional funds, whether from individuals, companies, institutions, regional countries, and extra-regional countries.
In a tweet, Cuba's foreign minister thanked CARICOM heads for rejecting the strengthening of the U.S. blockade against Cuba and the application of the Helms-Burton Act, as well as for their deep appreciation for Cuba's medical cooperation that for years has contributed to the well-being of its peoples. Coming up, large protests are taking place in Zimbabwe. More details when we come back.
Acompañamos a los pueblos que resisten en cada una de sus luchas.
Somos esa ventana que se abre para visibilizarlos entre fronteras.
Thursday, only on LS1.
Thank you for joining us again. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has hit out against remarks made by the country's last apartheid-era leader, Frederick de Klerk. Answering questions in Parliament, the president said apartheid was unquestionably a crime against humanity. During last week's State of the Nation address, the opposition economic freedom fighters protested at the presence of de Klerk, who had denied the system of racial segregation had been a crime against humanity.
Importantly, it also describes, so apartheid was so immoral in its conception and so devastating in its execution that there is no South African living today who is not touched by its legacy. I would even go on to say that to deny this, in my view, is treasonous.
Hundreds of Zimbabweans protested in the capital Harare on Wednesday against deteriorating living conditions. Protesters marched across the main streets of the city, calling on the government to find solutions to the rising cost of living. Due to high inflation rates, Zimbabwean citizens have been struggling to afford basic services. The situation has been worsened by droughts, which affected the country in the past 3 years. Tunisia's Prime Minister-designate Elias Fakhfakh has finally formed a new government, putting an end to a 4-month-long political crisis. The new coalition government came after reaching an agreement with the key Islamist-inspired Ennahda party, which had pulled out of the first government lineup a few days ago. The new government is likely to be approved by parliament, since the Ennahda party holds a majority there. The Russian Air Force has reportedly foiled a Turkish-backed military offensive against the Syrian army in Idlib province. It released aerial footage showing the attack, noting that the militants shelled the Syrian army's position in an attempt to breach its defensive lines. Russia's defense ministry added that it contacted Ankara, which prompted Turkish forces to stop the artillery barrage. The militants had used armored vehicles and Turkish artillery in some areas. The U.S. Democratic Party held a 2-hour-long debate in which 6 candidates defended their bid to challenge President Donald Trump for the upcoming elections. Among the topics discussed was health care, to which Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders said the government has failed citizens by maintaining expensive medical costs while enriching multi-million-dollar companies.
UK can do it, France can do it, Germany can do it, all of Europe can do it. Gee whiz, somehow or another, we are the only major country on earth that can't do it. Why is that? And I'll tell you why. It's because last year the healthcare industry made $100 billion in profits. Pharmaceutical industry, top 6 companies, $69 billion in profit. And those CEOs are contributing to Pete's campaign and other campaigns up here.
The powerful CGT labor union in France said they will no longer take part in discussions about how to fund the government's pension reform. The French parliament is expected to debate and vote on President Emmanuel Macron's reforms on the first week of March. Several unions have called for a general strike on February 20th, and as in previous strikes, public transport will likely be affected. And with that, we end our news brief, but you can find all of our stories by checking our website, telesurenglish.net. And for our viewers in Africa, you can find us on Starsat channel 461 in South Africa and channel 539 in Nigeria. And be sure to also join us on social media. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.